Okay, awesome, you guys. So welcome to our December video. We are here again with Shruti, who did our Facebook or our YouTube live last November, this last month, and we're happy to have her here with us again today. We've been talking a lot about self-care as a sibling, kind of hitting on some different aspects of it, what it looks like, what it kind of can be in day-to-day life, and we've been talking a lot about how it's not just the commercialized aspect of self-care. We're not talking about bubble baths and pedicures, or those can be a good part of a self-care plan. Kind of talking more about some of the deeper hard work that comes along with self-care. So we've invited Shruti back with us to talk a bit about grief and loss that comes with being a sibling, and not necessarily death loss, which is what we automatically think about, but just kind of the loss that comes, the loss of the perceived notion of a sibling. And I'll let Shruti just kind of jump on in and tell us a bit more about that.
Thank you so much, Colleen. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about this. It's not often that people think about grief when it comes to being a sib and having a sibling with a disability. And for me personally, for me, it came, I think I was in my late teenage years. I'm probably dating myself a bit here, but I used to send those Blue Mountain e-cards to my friends for birthdays and Christmas and things like that. And I had actually created an email account for my sibling who's 4 years younger than me. And the mindset for me was, well, one day when she understands, I'll show her all these e-cards that I sent her. Just, I guess what a lot of people do now for their kids, when a baby is born, they open a Facebook account, they open a Gmail account, and they think, okay, when they're old enough, they're going to be able to see all the stuff that they missed out on. I had done that for my sib years ago. And I remember it was one particular day where it kind of hit me like, okay, she's never going to understand what these emails mean and what these cards mean. And that's the day I realized, wow, this is grief. I am actually grieving my sibling, even though she's still alive. And she was born with cerebral palsy. And like I mentioned, she's 4 years younger than me. And her understanding would never be at a point where she would understand that I had sent her all these e-cards. So I got very interested in the topic of the disenfranchised grief and the fact that a lot of sibs and a lot of families are indeed grieving the person with the disability, even though they're still around, because we're grieving the idea of them and we're grieving what we thought they would be in our lives. For example, when my mom was pregnant with my sister, I was all excited about having this new sibling, and I was so sure it was going to be a girl, and I was already thinking about how we were going to play dolls together. And I had a Barbie house that I was kind of, waiting to introduce her to, and thinking about all the things that we would do together as siblings. And the grieving process never really finishes. It never gets complete, because it's like you're re-grieving at every step, at every stage of life. First, when you get the diagnosis, which a lot of people don't even get, then it's the phase where it's like, okay, this is supposed to happen at this stage, and then there's the special events. So whether it's high school graduation, or if it's a wedding, or if it's having a baby, at every step of the way, you're re-grieving this idea that you're supposed to have this sibling that's going to fit in. Your sibling's supposed to be the aunt or uncle to your kids, and realizing that that's not going to happen, or that's not happening right now, is really tough. And especially with the holidays, that's a time where everyone's supposed to come together, and those who believe in the magic of the holidays, everything's supposed to fall into place. But Sibs have this additional challenge of, as it is, we're kind of the caretakers all the time, and we're the ones doing all the understanding and saying, no, it's okay if things don't work out perfectly. But then we have that added layer of, some of us will never experience what it's like for our sibling to pick out a present for us. or to watch our sibling in a holiday concert, or to watch our sibling do something or accomplish something around the holidays that we're used to when we see our friends with their siblings. And so that's that added layer that keeps coming up, and we re-grieve it because it never really goes away. And then the other part that makes it really difficult as well is when you're talking about grief that has to do with a death loss, a lot of times there's a ritual that goes with it to bring closure. There's a funeral, there's a memorial service, there's a celebration of life when there's a death, where this kind of grief, it's not necessarily public and it's not announced and it's not always accepted because people don't realize, even we don't realize that we're grieving. And there's no real ceremony and there's no ritual to kind of close it up and to acknowledge that, yes, you did indeed lose something, even if it's an idea that you lost. And so we're kind of left with this open, raw feeling of, okay, what do I do with all the sadness and this grief? And sometimes there's even guilt that goes with the grief because you feel like you are grieving, but then you think, well, they're still alive, so why am I feeling this way? And then the guilt feelings can also come with that, and that doesn't add to the layer of complications. So that can be really challenging, especially around the holidays when everyone's supposed to be happy and supposed to put a smile on their face and believe in the magic.
Yeah, I think that can be one of those really tough pieces when you're thinking about, your sibling and how they're still alive, and so you feel bad even knowing that other
Right.
people lost their siblings. I think have a death
Right.
loss, and you can have that feeling of like, oh well, this isn't important. I don't need to grieve this right now. They're still alive. They're almost like lucky because I'm thinking of my own brother. Like we've been told, well, he shouldn't be alive right now. So
Right.
then there's kind of this piece of like, oh well, then we need to be thankful for what that
Yeah.
he's alive, as opposed to being like, well, no, I mean, he turned 16 today and there was no, birthday party with his friends. He was at home with my parents.
Congrats.
He doesn't, yeah. So he was 16 years old, which seems so old. But he wasn't out with his
Yeah.
friends at his birthday. He didn't have his sweet 16th birthday party. He's hanging out with my family today, So there can be all those different
Yeah.
pieces of it.
And that's what I mean by the grief keeps reappearing, because even when you think you're okay with the situation and you've accepted it, you've accepted reality, reality keeps changing.
Mm-hmm.
Because here he is at a milestone birthday, and again, it's like, oh, he's not out with his friends, he's with my parents. And it kind of reintroduces itself at every stage. So there are some added layers of complication and even acceptance. Every time you've accepted things the way they are, even that changes. So being patient with ourselves about that is really important. And acknowledging it, I think, just acknowledging that there is some grief in this process can be really powerful, and giving ourselves permission to feel what we need to feel.
Yeah. So thinking about how do we as siblings like address some of this grief? I've heard a couple of things you said. We've heard like definitely acknowledging it, I think, is the first step.
Right.
And then what other coping mechanisms or techniques can we use as siblings?
Something that I really love doing and I recommend a lot to my clients when I have therapy with them is writing or drawing any sort of expression, even if it's writing a song or drawing a picture, painting a picture. I personally love writing letters. So even if it's writing a letter to my sibling, which I know she's never going to be able to read or understand, it helps me feel like I'm expressing myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it also ties into that little piece of closure that I mentioned earlier, where I get to tell her, like, listen, these are the dreams that I had for us, and I know they're not going to be realized, but to at least put it down on paper so it feels valid, so it feels like somebody is listening to it or hearing me out, even though it's just going to go on a piece of paper and nobody's going to read it.
Mm-hmm.
It just feels a little bit validating to me. Like, um, there's a famous quote that says, grief is just love with nowhere to go. And the same can be said with this kind of grief with Sibs,
Yeah.
because we have all this love and we have all these ambitions and these ideas, and there's nowhere for them to go because we're realizing that the reality is very different than our dreams. So putting it down on paper helps to kind of solidify what our intentions are for our sibling. So that really helps. After accepting it, talking to people about it, and realizing that we're probably not alone in this.
Mm-hmm.
Realizing that, okay, everyone's kind of grieving their own thing, but this is a very special type of grief that isn't talked about often. And finding that support network wherever you can is really, really important. And finding ways to do something with your sibling if you're able to, whether it's going out with them or having your own little special holiday tradition with them, whatever their capacity is. That can also be really meaningful, because even if it's not exactly what you thought it would be, at least you're doing something. You're creating something special that's just you and them.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be kind of the silver lining, I guess you could say, of the grief, because you get to create something special that you normally wouldn't have created, and that gets to be just yours. So that can be really, really healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, creating your own special ritual, essentially,
Right. Exactly.
with your sibling. Yeah.
Right.
And then I think, back to the piece of talking about it, I think that's where the importance of, TSN, Texas Sibling Network, we host these meetups, and those can be very powerful for siblings to connect with one another and kind of be able to talk about some of those, parts of grief and loss that you can't, casually talk to your friends about a lot of these things, because they don't understand, because the response is usually like, well, but your sibling's still alive, they're still there. Like, it's people don't understand. I think a lot of times have a harder time understanding the loss throughout the lifespan that siblings face.
Absolutely. Yesterday, a few of the Massachusetts two board members met up and gave a presentation called No Sibling Left Behind. And towards the end of it, a few of us were just talking just about how we're the only ones who understand each other, when it comes to the grief, and when it comes to the being a protector, and always being the one to help other people, and all those traits that you really find in Sibs and you don't find elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So that is very, very powerful. It's almost like a casual group therapy.
Yeah. And for siblings who maybe are listening in and aren't able to attend in-person meetups, we do have SibNet, which I think can be a powerful tool for people to connect with other siblings that have the same shared life experiences. So SibNet's a Facebook group
Right.
online, so that can be a really great
Yeah.
connection for people to kind
Yeah.
of talk, yeah, have that connection to be able to share some of those feelings of grief and loss.
Right.
Especially,
And it's an open atmosphere. It's a safe environment, and people put stories up there all the time, or if they're just having a bad day. So that's a great resource. Thank you for mentioning that.
Shruti. And then I think I wanted to touch just kind of slightly on like death loss as well, because we know that we have some siblings who do experience a death loss. So if you just want to speak to that for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, of course, any death loss is hard, because what's happening is that you're comparing what you think should be happening in life with what's actually happening in life. And with a sibling, it's, I would say, 10 times harder, because you as a sib are playing so many different roles in their lives. You're a sibling, very often you're a caretaker, sometimes you're even a parent to them. I often feel like I'm my sibling's parent, even though both my parents are still alive and are very involved. I
Yeah.
feel like the third parent. And so it can also really mess with your identity, because once a sib, always a sib, right? You think like a sib, your responsibilities are like a sib, you are always the caretaker. And again, going back to grief is love with nowhere to go, when you lose a sibling with a disability, not only are you losing that person in your life, you're also losing a part of who you think you are and who you define yourself as. Because all of a sudden you kind of look around and say, well, most of my life or all of my life, I've dedicated myself and I've thought of myself as this person's sib. I'm the advocate. I'm the person that speaks up for them. I'm the caretaker. I'm the one who, teased them or taught them how to use a fork or whatever it was. And now what happens? Now what am I? What's my purpose?
Yeah.
And that can be really, really difficult. So again, a lot of added layers of complication. And sometimes there's even this layer of relief if a sibling passes away, because we're human beings. I mean, if we are a caretaker day in and day out, and the sibling no longer needs that because they're no longer around, it is very human and natural to feel a sense of relief, like, okay, I got my life back a little bit.
Yeah.
And then there's that added layer of guilt because you feel the relief.
Yeah.
So it can get very, very complicated.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, again, I think something that's really powerful is just talking about it and realizing that feelings are never wrong. No matter what you feel, you're validated and they're yours. And they're there for a reason. Our feelings are always there to tell us something. So realizing that it is valuable to talk about it and to kind of dissect where they're coming from. And I know that a lot of sibs don't necessarily get to dissect their feelings and make sense of them until their sibling passes away. And that's when they kind of take time for themselves and say, okay, I'm going to get into that therapy. I'm going to talk about things. So the sooner, the better. I just think it adds to the quality of life and to the relationship you have with your sibling.
Yeah, I think that goes a lot with the self-care of your mental self, is getting that therapy early on and finding a therapist who can also help you identify and work through some of that disenfranchised grief and loss.
Right, absolutely.
Plug for both of us to keep our professions, but
For sure.
definitely pretty helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Shruti, I think there's a lot of really great nuggets of wisdom in here, and I'm just so grateful that we were able to have you on again. I think our members just really learn a lot from you, and I learn a lot even just sitting here, thinking about all the different pieces of my life where I can see that disenfranchised grief from being a sib. So.
Well, thank you once again for having me.
And once again, we'll link in the comments to Shruti's contact information in case any of you guys are interested in learning more about the work that she does, or even just kind of check out her website, poking around, seeing what she can do for you guys. So thank you so much, Shruti.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great one.